In my previous video, I painted up these mummies and thought it would be a cool idea to make some terrain to go along with them. Before I started building some improbably large temple complex I don't have the storage space for, I thought I'd test out my plans with some scattered terrain. So here we are. These obelisks are much easier to make than they might look, and they're also very flexible. Apart from the obvious Egyptian-inspired settings like Khemri in the old Hammerworld or Stygia and Conan, you could just as easily cover them in elven runes or paint them dark metal and use some glowing paint effects on the symbols for a creepy sci-fi obelisk. To shape the obelisks, I started by cutting square sections of XPS foam on my hotwire table. You can do this part with a knife, this is just way faster. Once I had my sections, I marked the center using 2 lines across one of the faces. Then I set the guide that comes with the proxen to 45 degrees and lined up the center of the top face of the foam with the wire, making sure the guide does not hit the wire. I did not lock the guide in place, so I could use it to push the foam through the wire at a consistent angle. This lets me cut the pyramid at the top of the obelisk fairly easily. To taper the rest of the obelisk, I had to use a slightly different method, since the guide can't reach the wire at these angles. Instead, I used a piece of scrap foam, blue-tagged to the piece, to angle it along the fence, and pushed it through. To make sure I had consistent angles, I used some blue tack to stick the pieces I cut back into place, so each side always has the same offset. I was also careful to always register the spacer on the same top edge each time. Next, I took a regular ballpoint pen and started to draw some hieroglyphs on the surface. Since I've been asked this already, don't waste your time looking for hidden messages. These glyphs are just a mesh of styles and periods I happened to find in Google image search. So they probably don't say anything, although I might have accidentally written down the recipe for King Tut's favorite chicken soup, or the directions to the bathroom. There's no trick here, just break down every glyph into simple lines and use a consistent pressure. You want the glyphs deep enough that they will still be visible after painting, but not so deep that it will tear the foam. I aimed to have as much texture as I could, and it took me around 10 minutes per face. It was a relaxing way to pass the time. Once the obelisks were ready, I started to make some plinths for them. These were just square sections of XPS foam. I drew on some brickwork with a pen and then followed up with a pencil to add texture to the individual bricks. You can go wild here and even press in a few of the bricks to make them uneven. These plinths would be sandstone rather than granite like the obelisk, so there's going to be a lot more wear and tear on them. If you make a mistake with the pen, like I did here, don't panic. Just cut out the brick and your mistake is now texture. We don't make mistakes here, only happy textures. I found it easiest to glue the pieces together in pairs, so I glued the top of the plinth to the base, let that cure, and then glued in the obelisk. To make the bases, I cut some circles out of cardboard, 4 inches in diameter, and glued some expanded polystyrene on top. All of this is going to get covered, so there's no point in using the good stuff. If the bases warp, just spread some glue on the back and let it settle for a day. Thanks to Wylox Armory for that one. Now, the size of the base or even whether you have a base at all is really up to you and the games you play. For example, if you play grid-based games, just using the plinth by itself is probably fine. Just put some screws into the bottom to add some weight and you're good to go. If you play games where these have some kind of in-game effect though, it's useful to match up the base to the area of effect if it isn't too large. For example, if in your games you need to be within 2 inches of a static objective to contest it, making the base 2 inches in radius means you don't need to measure anything. If you're touching the base, you're contesting it. It's clearly visible and it saves a little time and argument about where to measure from every time. For some added variety, I took the obelisk I liked least and cut it to pieces. Just cut it halfway through and break off the rest. Don't just try to break it in one shot as it could bend. Now, this is definitely unrealistic. In real world, Egyptian obelisks are made of a single block of granite, and they're not going to break like this unless they're toppled over. On the other hand, we're not talking about real world, and there are plenty of giants, dragons and adventurers to damage property in unusual ways. Once the obelisks were glued to the bases, I painted them over with a mixture of PVA glue, black paint, water and dish soap. I made this mix a little more watery than I usually do, so it wouldn't clog the glyphs. I use PVA because it's more easily available where I live, although you can of course use Mod Podge. With the sealer dry, I went and covered the base with crackle paste. This worked out better here than it did with the model bases. Thanks to Jerazob for pointing out that crackle paste works better on smoothed surfaces. The sealer certainly helped here. At this point I had my cracked dirt, and I wanted to add some sand on top. To get this, I first put down some PVA glue and sprinkled the sand on. Then I sealed it with some surgical spirit and watered down glue. To add a little more variety in the texture, I then made a paste out of baking soda and watered down glue. This worked really well, and I think next time I'll use this for the sand layer as well. Once the base was dry, I primed and undercoated everything in grey and white, and started to base coat everything in burnt sienna. This works okay for these models, but if I had to do anything larger, I'd look for a spray of this color to cut down on the time. Next, I gave everything a heavy dry brush of cadmium orange. Most of this will be hidden by the next layer, but it adds some nice undertones which will still be visible. Finally, I dry brushed everything in Naples yellow. To dry brush, load up the brush with paint, then wipe most of the excess off on a piece of paper towel. Then lightly move the brush across the surface with minimal pressure. The raised surfaces will catch the bristles and the recesses won't. And that's basically it really. You can build up really thin layers this way. I hear some people look down on dry brushing as a lazy technique, but that's exactly why I use it here. It's efficient. As an added bonus, one problem with this technique is that unless you use a really soft brush, it will leave the surfaces looking a bit dusty. Normally a problem, but these are desert pieces, so win. Just don't do it with your super expensive brushes, as it's not very good for their health. After that, it was just a case of giving the slot a clear coat, and they're good for the table. I might add some grass tufts at a later stage to add a bit more color here, but for the time being I'm good with these. Bye!